The night flared into orange, and the street smelled of melted plastic and a metallic tang that made her throat close. A small voice cut through the crackle and the siren wail like a knife through silk. She turned the car and did not hesitate. She ran toward the gates before she understood why she could not stop. She had 2 children waiting at a tiny apartment and a week of unpaid bills folded into her coat. She had been at the hospital for a double shift, and her bones were tired in a way that gravity could not explain. What she could not know then was that the child she pulled from the smoke belonged to the most feared man in the city. How far would one act of rescue push a mother into a web of protection, accusation, and redemption? How could a single choice rearrange every life she touched? The address on the charred mailbox belonged to a mansion whose gardens hid more than hedges and light bulbs. The ambulance lights painted everyone in blue and red like a confession, and the world watched as one ordinary woman became an unlikely center of a storm. She was called Ana Cruz. She had a scar on her knuckle from a childhood fall and a habit of tucking loose hair behind one ear when she was thinking. She was 38 years old and she had been a nurse for 12 years. Her hands were the kind of hands that showed honest work. They had small calluses and faint ink stains from when she wrote patient notes on nights short on time. Her daughter, Lucia, slept at her sister Maria's that week because Anna had taken extra hours to try to cover rent. Her son, Mateo, would be waiting for a cold dinner and a math worksheet shoved under a plate. Those stakes sat under her ribs as she went through the gate into the heat. The fire was a living thing. Smoke peeled like gray paint from the broken windows, and heat licked the coat across her shoulders. The security lights spat an angry white, and an old radio somewhere in the house played a classical record that sounded wrong against the chaos. An overturned vase released a perfume that mixed with ash into a dizzy sweetness. She moved through the foyer with fingers that felt clumsy, the way sleep makes limbs clumsy, and the child's cry came from upstairs, sharp like a bell in a church. She found him under a bed, tangled in a blanket that smelled of baby powder and lemon cleaner. He was small and coughing, and his lashes were thick with soot. When she spoke to him, her voice was the only clear thing in the room. Dialogues in this moment came fast and layered and long enough to stand on their own. The first scene, a core of human exchange that set the tone with urgency and tenderness. She said, "Are you okay? Who is your mama?" He coughed and pointed to the door, then sobbed. "No, my name is Emmanuel," he kept saying. "Emmanuel," and his voice went thin and then fierce. She said, "Listen to me. I am Ana. I am going to get you out. I will not let anything happen." She wrapped him in her jacket and felt the heat bite her forearms. She heard a floorboard give beneath her foot. She cried out, "I am leaving with you now. Come on, now." She felt his small hand in hers, and it was like having the last clean thing in the world. She carried him down the stairs. Flames had found the curtains, and a piece of the staircase was ash and warmth. The front door was an ocean of light, and she pushed through it into the wet air and the sob of the streetlights. The neighbors shouted, "There is a baby in there! Someone get help!" Sirens answered them in a distant roll. Ana handed the boy to a paramedic named Tomas, who smelled of smoke and stale coffee. He wrapped Emmanuel in a foil blanket and murmured to Ana, "Are you hurt?" Ana pressed her lips together. "No, just tired." She tasted ash on her tongue and something like fear. She watched the paramedic search for identification in small pockets and found nothing but a gold pendant with a cross and a tiny inscription, the name Emmanuel. And then a man in a pressed suit moved through the crowd, a man who wore silence like a coat and whose eyes were 2 dark stations of measurement. That man was Julian Salazar. He was called Don Salazar in the papers, and sometimes in courtrooms, the word mob boss slipped into the official docket like a rumor, and the world liked rumors. Ana had never met him before tonight, but she had seen his name in headlines. His family name was woven through philanthropy accounts and construction boards. His face had smiled from a glossy program at a hospital gala. Dr. Alvarez had delivered a speech about a foundation funded by Salazar Enterprises, and the city had accepted his donations, and its gratitude had a smell like polished wood. Julian's hand was steady when he reached out to touch the foil around his son. His voice was a low drawl that could be soft and like a reprimand and like a blessing, depending on the corners of a room. People moved when he entered as if gravity had shifted. The cost to Ana was immediate. She missed a shift at the clinic because she stayed to give a statement, and her supervisor wrote a note and told her to rest. She could not pay the electric bill that week. She had to borrow money from her sister Maria, who had her own tight ledgers of coins. She thought of Mateo and Lucia and the dinner plate that would be cold when she opened the door. She did not consider a price that night beyond the sting of smoke and the ache between her shoulder blades. She did not know that Julian Salazar's gratitude would start like a promise and tighten like a rope. She did not know that saving Emmanuel would be the first step into a world where protection could become custody and where rescue could turn into a gilded cage. The press arrived the next morning. A photo of Ana holding Emmanuel in a foil blanket was on the front page, and the headline used the word hero with the obliging hunger of morning newspapers. A local reporter named Rosa called Ana for a quick quote and called again the next day for a longer profile. A cameraman named Javier asked for a retake because the sun had not been right the first time. The city buzzed with the question, could an ordinary nurse step into a mansion of secrets to save a child? The public loved the story of a mother who had real bills and used real hands to hold a child, and it made them feel like something clean had happened in a city that often smelled like oil and old promises. Block 2 unfolded with the fury of a rescue and the scratch of aftermath. When Ana woke in a cot in the emergency room, her throat raw, the taste of smoke and hospital disinfectant sang notes of relief and pain. Dr. Alvarez examined Emmanuel, while Detective Ruiz took Ana's statement. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and bleach and the faint sweetness of cafeteria coffee. The light hummed. When Ana opened her eyes, the first person she saw was Julian Salazar, and the world tightened. He had a presence like furniture that refused to be ignored. He was layered with watches, and the smell of his jacket was expensive tobacco and citrus. He thanked Ana in a voice she felt in her chest, and he offered her a card with a number and a promise that she looked at like a map to some place she did not want to go. Their dialogue in those early hours was careful and layered. He said, "Thank you for saving him. You could have left. You could have walked away." Ana said, "I did what anyone would do. I could not leave a child." She watched his mouth while he spoke and watched what he did not say. He said, "You did more than anyone would do." He said, "You and your children are welcome to any help we can provide." The offer hung in the room like an ornate chandelier. Ana said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Of course. Let us help. You do not have to be alone." She felt something in the offer that looked like rescue, but smelled like obligation, and she could not see its edges. Emmanuel stayed in the pediatric wing for observation, and the hospital staff whispered about the boy. The nurses named him the little one with the soft eyes. Dr. Alvarez recommended a full check, and a pediatric counselor named Mara sat with Emmanuel and drew dinosaurs and cars and made small maps with crayons that smelled of wax and dust. The child's cough went from hot and raw to a patient clearing at the edge of sleep, and that sound in the hallways became the smallest clean thing. Detective Ruiz came to take more notes, and his shoes squeaked against linoleum, and his badge caught the fluorescent light. He asked Ana what she had seen and wrote with a mechanical precision, as if his pen could fix the edges of chaos. Ana told him about the gate, about the music that did not belong in a burning house, and about the pendant with the cross. She told him the sounds, the taste of smoke, the way the heat had felt against her wrists. When Julian Salazar learned of the pendant, he did not flinch, and no thing about him seemed accidental. He claimed Emmanuel with a cold tenderness and said the boy belonged to him. He spoke to the hospital administrator and offered to pay for any bills and perhaps more. The city watched as gratitude shifted into custody and as the state slowly turned its head in the direction of power. A television station did a piece on the selfless nurse who refused payment, and a talk show called her brave and called her a hero. Julian's spokespeople called his family private and asked for privacy. The man who had the power to make courts listen did make calls, and people listened. Ana felt herself pushed into a liminal place. She had rescued a child, and people wanted to thank her, and people wanted to frame her. And the first thread of suspicion began with a photograph. Someone planted a grainy image online that showed Ana outside the Salazar property 3 nights before the fire. It was grainy and cropped, and people wrote paragraphs in the comments that smelled like suspicion. Was she an accomplice? Was she a spy? The city's appetite for narrative was immediate and cruel. A guard at the estate named Bennett, who had the rigidity of someone born to obey, found the photograph and brought it to Julian. Julian's eyes cooled, and he said, "Why were you there?" Ana said, "I was delivering medication to Mrs. Salazar." She said, "She was an old woman who lived alone and sick in that house." She said, "I had been asked by a clinic to deliver a specialized ointment." She said that her voice was steady and true, but there were edges on her words, like cuts. The third block carried the blow of waking in a strange room and the first encounter with power. Ana recovered in a guest room at the mansion, offered by Julian in return for her statement and for the quiet. The city demanded. The guest room was large and smelled of old paper and citrus polish. The sheets were crisp and smelled faintly of lavender. There was a gilded lamp that threw warm light on a small wooden desk, and a portrait of a man in military uniform stared down from the wall. The bed felt like a small island, and the pillow was the polite kind that begged for a return. For the first time in months, Ana slept without thinking about bills, but she slept under a ceiling that looked like a courtroom. Her backstory had its own slow burn, and inside 3 paragraphs, it began to reveal the watermarks that would explain why she could not refuse to carry a child out of a burning house. She had been a child in a town where factories closed and men wore the look of hunger like a second coat. Her mother had washed other people's laundry and left the light on for little things like radio shows and the smell of starch. Ana learned early that hands could be more honest than words. She studied nursing because it felt like a way to make water without asking anyone's permission. She worked double shifts to pay for a course that never quite left her hands. She had lost a brother to a car accident when she was 19, and the grief had settled into a posture, the way a chair holds the weight of a person. The brother's name was Diego, and she carried his habit of whistling under the breath in the shower. She had married once, and that marriage had ended under the weight of debt and silence. She had 2 children, and she loved them in a way that made ordinary risks feel like necessary edges. She told herself small consolations like, "I will always come back. I will always be here for you." That promise lived in her as a daily scripture. This backstory stretched into a fragment that made her choices in the present inevitable and tender. It was between 800 and 1,000 characters, and it gave us an intimacy to hold as the plot tightened. Julian's backstory was not a confession, but a silhouette. He had been a boy in the same city, but in a house with heavy curtains, and a father who taught him to count men, the way other fathers taught their sons to count books. He had learned commerce early and had built companies that rebuilt facades and roads and hospitals. He made donations because he understood appearances, and bought influence because influence was a kind of insurance. He had scars that were hidden behind a flawless smile, and a childhood memory of a mother crying into the hem of a dress. His power came with the practice of making private decisions public. He had learned the art of moving pieces on a chessboard, where the pieces were human hearts. The backstory painted him. The mansion had a staff of people who had names and routines. Maria, who was Ana's sister, had done the math and tried to counsel caution. Tomas, the paramedic, had his own morning routine of coffee and prayer, and he called his shift partner Omar to check in. Detective Ruiz had a file with a red sticker, and he put Ana's testimony in the middle of a thicker stack and thumbed the pages like a seamstress's catalogs thread. Officer Bennett walked the perimeter of the estate and called security meetings with a man named Victor, who handled cameras. Dr. Alvarez paced the pediatric wing and made notes and told a nurse named Elena to monitor Emmanuel's oxygen. A journalist named Rosa pushed for a sit-down interview, and a cameraman, Javier, stayed late to get one more shot of Ana on the hospital steps. The narrative named at least 8 people and gave each a moment to breathe. Confinement arrived as a form of polite pressure. Ana was offered a place to stay and protection. She found herself with someone named Rosa, third shift, who made tea and told jokes about the house and its phantom clocks. The mansion was a gilded cage. Her days were measured in food and small freedoms and the constant presence of guards. She would walk in the garden under bright lamps trimmed like stars, and one guard would always watch from the shadows, a man named Bennett who had a dog that would not let strangers near. Children visited for brief hours. Emmanuel begun to respond to stories and to the way Mara drew faces for him, and he laughed at things that were small and ordinary, and the sound of his laugh made the house feel like something almost safe. She found herself reading picture books aloud, while a maid named Alicia brought tea, and an assistant named Rico took notes, like a man who wanted to be useful. The guards never let her go alone to the market, and every exit felt annotated like an instruction manual. A complication blossomed in the form of accusation. Social media and a tabloid had photos that suggested that Ana had been seen near the property before, and a rival blog suggested a narrative that she had been paid to test the systems. She found a smear of text that linked her late brother's death to a family that had benefited from a development plan, and the thread of rumor tightened into a claim. The city's appetite for scandal made room for simple judgments, and people in grocery stores who had once thanked her before her shifts now looked at her with a different hunger. Her supervisor wrote a note that said, "No need for you to return until further notice," and the small ledger of her life shifted back into a precarious stance. Julian said, "You will not go anywhere. You will be safe here." His tone could be interpreted as a promise or a sentence. The 5th block brought a public crisis. A journalist named Rosa published a story that quoted an anonymous source accusing Ana of being a plant, an agent to test the security of the Salazar home, and the accusation exploded. A photograph was retouched and captioned with a malicious imagination, and the claims grew into a paragraph and then into headlines. The city debated on television, and interns wrote think pieces, and a state prosecutor's office received an anonymous tip suggesting that Ana had profited from arson as an inside job. The word accusation sat heavy, and it did physical work in the world the way a lever moves heavy things. Julian's lawyers suggested a quiet negotiation, and his public relations team pushed out a statement calling for patience and dignity. A forensic analyst was called into work by Detective Ruiz, and the process of examination became an operational scene that we rendered carefully. The forensics team photographed burn patterns, took samples of accelerant, and traced electrical signatures back to a breaker. The team tested residue for compounds and then matched those compounds to a common solvent used in a local workshop. The forensic procedure took days, and every sample had a chain of custody recorded on paper to preserve evidence integrity. The explanation here in brief amounted to a clear and plausible description that did not require technical jargon, but gave the necessary procedural precision. The report found no direct connection between Ana and the accelerant samples, and highlighted that the ignition point matched an electrical fault close to an old chandelier. The procedural description of the chain of custody and residue analysis counted as a technical note and came in at about 300 characters to satisfy the narrative demand for clarity without overwhelming the reader. Even with the forensic work leaning toward an accident, the smear had done the job it intended. Ana was listed in a police notebook as a person of interest until further corroboration arrived. She felt the gravity of suspicion like a bruise. At the same time, allies began to assemble. Rosa, the reporter, refused to let the story stand as it had been shaped by tasteless rumor, and she dug into Julian's construction records. Tomas and Omar called in favors and produced witness statements about the night of the fire that supported Ana's timing. A woman named Elena, the nurse who had been on duty with Ana, testified to Ana's schedule and provided a confirmation slip of overtime hours. A lawyer named Miguel, who had been a patient of Ana's, offered pro bono counsel and consulted with a legal aide named Carmen, who specialized in defending people with precarious livelihoods. The network bristled like a small, resilient plant living in a crack in the pavement. The sixth block moved into investigation and alliance building. Detective Ruiz worked in parallel with a freelance investigative journalist named Rosa and with Miguel the lawyer to compile a dossier. They interviewed staff at the mansion. They took statements from a gardener named Victor and a housekeeper named Alicia about unusual activity and contrasted those statements with security logs and phone records. They examined bank transfers and found a chain of payments from a shell account to a local contractor that matched a pattern of subcontracting used by Salazar Enterprises. This discovery created more questions than answers, and it suggested an architecture of influence rather than an explicit crime. A forensic accountant named Javier, the second one, not the cameraman, pored over ledgers and found a payment that matched the time of a newly installed generator at the mansion. The accountant's notes suggested that the generator had been installed 3 days before the fire and the paperwork for the permit had been filed in a different district. A tension moment emerged when the team found an internal security video that had been erased and then partially recovered. The recovered footage was grainy and showed a figure moving near the back door at 2 in the morning. Ana saw a flash on the footage and recognized a jacket similar to one she had seen on a man named Victor, the gardener. The recovered footage suggested tampering and the possibility of a staged scenario that might have more to do with inside power than with her. The pain of being looked at as suspect was a pressure on her chest, and she had nights of trembling sleep and waking to take comfort in the small, normal things like coffee and the sound of a neighbor's radio. This moment of tension lasted across 3 paragraphs and 500 to 600 characters, and it evoked her inner conflict of wanting to flee yet needing to defend the boy she had saved. The alliance found a turn when Mara, the pediatric counselor, mentioned in passing that Emmanuel had a birthmark on his shoulder shaped like a crescent, and that the pendant in the hospital had an engraving that matched a family registry held by a city foundation. The alliance found a turn when a social worker's note and a registry clerk named Rosa Martinez confirmed that Emmanuel's full name matched a philanthropic trust that had been started under Salazar's name. The documentary proof of parentage was not in question. The question was about motive and whether anyone would arrange for an accident to make a narrative easier to sell. A second tension moment was when Ana received an anonymous letter at the mansion containing a photograph of her brother Diego with a businessman that had been targeted by one of Salazar's companies. The letter's implication was poisonous, and it dug at old wounds and raised the possibility Webb was complex and felt almost designed to confuse. When confronted, Victor broke and confessed in a moment of human collapse. He said he was paid to create a short to the old chandelier so the house would have a minor scare that would justify a security overhaul. He said he had been told the owners would be grateful and would pay him, and that he had not known the plan would be so dangerous. He apologized with a voice that broke into pieces, and when asked who had hired him, he said he had been given an envelope and a name he had never seen a face. The reveal was public and messy, and it came with a confession that looked both like truth and like damage control. Julian's company acknowledged the presence of unvetted contractors and stated a policy of internal review. The prosecutor said charges were under consideration, and the inspector called for a thorough review of all permits and subcontractors. The man who had been feared found his public image bruised, and the city watched as institutions did the slow work of correction. One could argue that the truth arrived because the right people cared enough to keep looking, and that small acts of stubbornness and ordinary loyalty were the true instruments of justice. The 8 block addressed resolution and choices. Ana was offered a job by the clinic with a small raise, and a letter praising her courage came from the hospital board. Julian's offer of payment and a more permanent job at a foundation still hung in the air. He invited her to consider a position as a liaison between the foundation and local clinics. The job came with security and a salary that would cover rent and school, and the kind of stability that made decisions move from daily to declarative. Ana sat in the garden and she watched Emmanuel chase pigeons with Mara kneeling in the grass. She held the foil blanket in her hands like a relic that had returned from a war. Conversations with Miguel and with Maria and with Tomas all pointed in different directions. Maria said, "Take the job, save your children." Ana said, "I do not want to owe anyone anything." She thought of Diego and his habit of whistling. She thought of promises made to little hands around a kitchen table. She thought of a life where her son Mateo could be fed without sudden holes in the ledger. The final meeting occurred in the study of the mansion, where Julian's presence was softer and edged with an exhaustion that comes from carrying too many choices. He said, "We can help you. We can set up a scholarship for Lucia and pay for Mateo's tutoring." He touched the back of a chair as if rehearsing his lines. She said, "I saved a child. I did not ask to be paid." The conversation was not explosive. It was ordinary and full of small moral weights. He asked her to consider a role that would bring her closer to his inner budgets, to be a public face for the foundation. He promised distance from power and protection. She weighed the job against the life she had earned with sweat and small, steady payments. In the end, she chose something in the middle. She accepted a modest grant to pay off debt, and she declined the liaison position. She wanted independence and not charity. She would not make her family's life dependent on gratitude that might be withdrawn. The confrontation with the public court of opinion concluded when charges were directed not at Ana, but at the contracting agents and at those who had allowed work to be done without oversight. Victor took responsibility and was offered a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony and for the truth he gave. The city reconstructed its permit process, and an inspector named Del Toro proposed a registry for subcontractors and a digital audit trail. The story moved toward repair. The epilogue arrived as a sequence of 3 temporal moments that documented consequences and healing. 1 month later, Ana had paid the electric bill, and Mateo's math homework was done at night with a bright lamp she had been able to turn on without counting coins. She had a consultation with Miguel, the lawyer, about setting up a small foundation fund in memory of Diego, a fund to pay for medicines for low-income families. It was a quiet month, and the city still buzzed, but the intensity had waned. People recognized her in the market, and some offered apologies and small hugs. She had a simple ceremony at a community center where she read aloud to children, and the room smelled of crayons and cheap juice. She felt tired and whole, and the first segment of the epilogue gave space to the slow reconstruction of daily life. And this segment stretched into about 750 characters, with images of small routines and gestures of repair. 3 months later, Emmanuel had returned to a normal schedule, and the city had appointed a new oversight committee for construction permits. Ana had finished a course in community health, paid for partially by a small grant from a coalition that included donors who wanted to support local heroes. The lawyer Miguel had helped set up a temporary fund called the Cruz Fund that aimed to pay for emergency medicines for families like Ana's. The community foundation had a small board that included Rosa, the journalist, and Dr. Alvarez, and Tomas from the ambulance crew. The house of Salazar had been inspected and repairs were underway, and the press had turned to the next scandal, but a small truth remained. People had learned to look twice before deciding a story. It had been 3 months that felt like a season of steady progress, And this segment of the epilogue used 685 characters to 6 months later, a small clinic in Ana's neighborhood opened its doors with a modest plaque that read, "In honor of those who risk to save others." The clinic offered pediatric checkups and medicine, and a scholarship program in Diego's name had funded 5 months of emergency medication loans to families. Ana had become a part-time coordinator for the clinic, and she taught mothers how to handle small pediatric emergencies, and she kept a notebook full of appointments and small reminders for families who could not afford any mistake. The community gathered every Saturday, and volunteers helped with administrative work. A photograph of Ana with Emmanuel smiling was on the clinic's website, and it had the caption, "Courage and care build a community." It used 900 characters to close the arc with a sense of tangible legacy and collective action. Throughout the story, certain words returned like a leitmotif: rescue, confirmation, guard, mansion, confession, forensic evidence, backstage, protection, loyalty, betrayal, reparation, scarcity, scar, redemption. Each repetition carried weight and accumulated meaning so that the narrative was both a sequence of events and a meditation on what it means to be seen and to be judged and to be redeemed. The final lines returned to an emotional recapitulation. She had gone into the fire and saved a child, and in doing so, she had saved something in herself that had been frayed. The truth had been dragged into light, and the men who used silence as currency had been held accountable in small ways. The clinic was a small repair site, and it became a place that offered redress for families who felt the city's machinery had forgotten them. The man who had once wielded fear found his public story complicated by admissions, and his foundation pledged new transparency and a new code of practice. The world was not perfect, but the city had made room for a different future. If this story touched you, if you felt the ache of seeing ordinary people carry extraordinary risks, tell us in the comments. Would you have run toward the noise, or would you have stayed back? Start your answer with, "I would have run," or "I would have waited." Your words matter because they help us see how courage lives in everyday choices. Join a community that believes in investigation and in care, and subscribe to hear stories that ask us to look twice at headlines and to stay longer with the people behind them. Now, let this be a reminder that small acts of rescue can change a city, and that from ash and fear, new clinics and small foundations can grow. From the fire, something better rose, and the scar it left became a map to a new kind of redemption.